Go ahead and open up your Bibles, book of Hebrews. Chapter 11, about verse 20, if you would. Good to see you all out this morning. We appreciate you being here in Bible class. I think as we've gotten down into it, like I said, go ahead and about verse 20. We've been going through and looking at these figures as we've gone through the Hall of Faith. Now, real quick, as we get to this point, we're in what is kind of considered to be the final chunk as far as Hebrews is concerned, as far as applications go. So remember the first part of the book, and really the biggest chunk of the book, going from chapter 1 all the way to a little bit into chapter 8, we were dealing with a better leader. And this was the comparisons we were talking about and looking at Christ versus looking at all of the Old Testament figures that he's up against as far as the prophets are concerned. We even compared him up against the angels. We talked about him as far as the priesthood, and we found that he is better in every which way. Then we went over and we talked about a better covenant, which that led us into the reality that the New Testament is better. And that's what this book is about, isn't it? It's about things that are better. The better covenant, the better leader that is Christ. And so that led us ultimately to the final conclusion of the book, which is, as we're dealing with in these final few chapters, a better life. And so as we're looking at these things, as we've gone through about the middle part of chapter 10, all the way to where we're at about the middle ways in chapter 11, we've been discussing these things that talk about why, because we have Christ, because we are under the New Testament, why we have a better life because of it. And really remember, the focus is on endurance. And that's really the end of this book, is it's talking about and it's looking at giving us the encouragement. It's a book of exhortation. It's a book of telling us to power through, to keep moving forward. And that's what this book is about. And so we've gone through chapter 11 so far. And chapter 11 begins, if you remember back in verse number 1, with telling us what faith is. Now you remember back in chapter 10, it talked about the full assurance of faith. And then in chapter 11, it's going to tell us, and it's going to define what faith is. And of course, as we got into Hebrews chapter 11, verse number 6, as we got in here to verse number about verses 13 through 16, we talked about what faith is. And so as we made our way over this way today, we're in about verse number 20. And remember, chapter 11 is a chapter that is the by faith chapter. It's talking about all of these people who, through faith, and it's showing us what faith is. And one of the biggest things we need to focus on as we look through this is faith is something that is not passive. None of these people we've talked about to this point just had a mental acknowledgement that, yep, I believe in God. That's not what faith is. That's not the definition of godly faith, biblical faith. They all did something as a result of their belief in God and their faith in God. And so we really look at, whenever we understand and kind of relate these things together, there is movement that has to happen on our part. And so as the Hebrew author is going through this, he's saying, look at all these examples of faith. And I think one thing you and I need to look at, we say, well, how is the application to us today? Well, remember, listen, you and I are not alone. We're not the first ones going through this. We're not the first ones going through hard times. And so we left off in verse number 20 last week. Let's go ahead and look at verse number 20 of chapter 11. And so we've made it, and we've talked about a lot of figures to this point. But now we're talking about Isaac. And remember what we said last week? Hebrews kind of shed some light, some interesting light on some of these figures, that maybe even from a different perspective, we don't really necessarily see that angle from them as we go through, and we went through their original story in the Old Testament. But the Hebrew author kind of sheds a little bit more light on it. So let's talk about Isaac for a second. Verse number 20. Hebrews 11, verse number 20 says, by faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. Now, if you stop at the end of verse number 20, would you say that's a very interesting take on the story of Jacob and Esau as far as Isaac is concerned? Whenever you and I think of the story of Isaac and we think of Jacob and Esau, who was Isaac's favorite? Do you remember? Esau. Now, when they were born, who were we told the promise would go through? That's right, even before they were born, the prophecy was there that the younger would rule the older. And so it was given to Jacob all along. But Isaac was very determined and very set on giving the blessing to Esau despite that. And so, unfortunately, the way the story kind of goes, we have Isaac and Rebekah, and they kind of hatch this little plan, don't they, Jacob and Rebekah hatch the plan to go ahead and get Isaac to give the blessing to Jacob. But whenever he does that, and even whenever he is tricked, I think the one thing is the fact that even though he is tricked in it, does he still give Jacob the blessing? And even whenever he is confronted with the reality, whenever Esau comes in, he says, well, I've just given the blessing. He still holds firm that the blessing he gives does go to Jacob. So at the very least, despite the controversy in the story, we can say Isaac's faith may have been less than his father's and less than those that were before him, but he still had faith enough to obey God and carry through with the blessing. And so whatever we say about Isaac, we do have the silver lining that at the very least, he does carry through. Now, well, like I said, that's a very interesting take on the story of Jacob and Esau, but that kind of gives us the insight that even though these things were controversial, at the very least, he does carry through with those promises. Any other thoughts about Isaac? Okay, let's go to verse number 21. By faith, Jacob, when he was a-dying, blessed both the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning upon the top of his staff. So just prior to Jacob's death, you remember he gave blessings to each of his sons. That's one of the most important kind of segues you see between Jacob's life and going back to the life of his sons. And these blessings were prophecies about each son's descendant. Now, of course, Jacob is also known as who? Israel. So we have Israel, and from Israel we have, and remember, as we kind of look at the messianic promise and the prophecy all the way back to Abraham, that in his seed all the world would be blessed, it's kind of the best way I've ever found of putting it is that as you go through Genesis, it's like looking at a bullseye. And so as you think about the outer ring, the kind of the largest prophecies that's coming through Abraham, well, as each descendant comes, it gets narrower and narrower of who that Messiah is going to come through. So by the time we get it, and of course it's coming through Jacob, who's also Israel, which of Jacob's sons would the messianic prophecy go through? Which tribe was Jesus of? Judah. So his son Judah would carry through. And then we get even more specific, that which specifically family of Judah would the lineage of Jesus be carried through? Who would be our second king in Israel?
David.
And we have David, that's right. So it's like a bullseye, it just keeps getting narrower and narrower. And so as Jacob is giving these promises and these prophecies there in verse number 21, the important thing is, does Jacob live to see these prophecies come to pass? No. Matter of fact, he dies long before that. Does he still believe they're going to happen? Yes. And so he doesn't do something that's so narrow-minded and says, I need to be here to see this and carry it through. He has faith enough to deliver these promises, deliver these prophecies, and he has full faith that they will happen. Do they happen? They absolutely do. And they happen, if you think about that, we're thinking, okay, we're talking all the way from Jacob looking to Christ. That's a long ways away from that prophecy and that promise to be fulfilled. And yet, still has faith enough to deliver it. So any other thoughts on Jacob? Verse number 22. One of the sons of Jacob. It says, by faith Joseph, when he died, made mention of the departing of the children of Israel and gave commandment concerning his bones. So all of these, as you stop at the end of verse 22, you notice that all of these, we're talking about these promises and these prophecies, that they have faith enough that it's going to happen even after they're gone. That's what verses 13 through 16 told us, is that even though that they did not experience it in their life, even though they did not see it fulfilled in their life, they have faith enough that it's going to happen and take place. And so specifically as we're looking at Joseph, Joseph knows of the promises given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so when he's dying, it talks about there, makes mention of the departing. So he left orders that whenever Israel goes back to Canaan, because he knows they're going to eventually go back, that they're supposed to take his bones back with him and bury him in that land. Does that happen? It sure does. Now imagine this for a second. How distant in the future is that going to take place? From where Joseph is at, that is a lot of generations in between before his bones are actually carried back, but he believed God would fulfill that promise. And so you think about that as they're wandering in the wilderness and as they're going through Canaan, they're carrying Joseph's bones around with them, all for the fulfillment of that prophecy. And whenever they do finally arrive there after the conquest of Canaan, we finally see his bones delivered. And so that's a prophecy and that's a promise that he gives that he'll never see, of course. It's going to be long after he's dead. Still has faith enough in God. Now, we keep saying all of these things, that they're not there alive to see that. What do you think this has to do with you and I? What do you think the application of all of these things are?
Just so that we know the promises that made to us, right?
That's right. So we can have faith enough that even if I don't experience that promise fulfilled in my lifetime, can I still have faith enough that it will be? Whenever we think about the promise of heaven, obviously in this lifetime I'm not going to witness that, but can I still have faith and assurance knowing that it's going to happen? I sure can. And I can have faith enough that just like all of these who would never experience it in their lifetime, to live life with the full assurance knowing that these things are going to happen. These things are going to come to fruition. They may not see with their own eyes, and obviously they wouldn't. It's just like you and I. You know, when we talk about what faith is, the evidence of things not seen, that substructure, verse number 1 talks about the foundation of our faith. And that's what it is for you and I. You and I can have all the confidence in the world that these things will happen, and we have to. It's part of what it is to be a Christian. It's that very foundation of our faith. All right, so through verse 22. Now let's go to a little bit longer of this section, verse number 23. And we're going to read 23 down through 28 because all of these things are talking about Moses. Let's think about Moses for a second. It says, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents because they saw he was a proper child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandment. By faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured, seeing him who is invisible. Through faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he that destroyed the firstborn should touch them. So let's stop in the end of verse number 28 for a second, because the story of Moses continues, but it goes instead of just Moses to talk about Israel. So we've got a couple of different people mentioned here. So verse number 23, we get to talk about for a moment the faith of Moses' parents. So Moses' parents, how long did it say it hid Moses? 3 months. They say that he's a proper child, he's a beautiful child. And it's amazing, do we have any record of any direct promise that God made to Moses' parents? Interestingly enough, you'll not find that. You'll not find a direct promise because it's not given there. But do they still trust in God? They sure do. They trust in God. They trust in God's protection. So as we go through the story of Moses, obviously, and as we remember his story, he ends up in verse number 24 in Pharaoh's household. And so here he is being raised this way, but in verse number 24, we see him taking a different path of going with the Egyptians and going with Pharaoh's household. So he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And I want you to look in verse number 25. It tells us, why did he make this decision? Where was the greater treasure at? Even if he had to suffer for a little while, where did he say the greater treasure was?
In God and in his people.
That's right. God and his people. And it says there in verse number 25, so he chose that suffering. He chose that affliction. And if you ever stop for a second and think about Moses, Moses could have had a very different story, couldn't he? Because he was already elevated in Pharaoh's household. He'd already had all of the blessings of an Egyptian prince, if you would. And so he has all of these blessings. And yet it was a decision he made. In verse 25, that first word there, it tells us a lot about Moses. He chose to take the path of God's people. He chose to follow through with that. He chose to go with the people of God. And in verse number 26, it talks a little bit about why that is the case. And you look at the faith aspect of it. So he preferred to suffer with God's people and go after that greater treasure. And at the end of verse number 26, it says, for he had respect of the recompense of the reward. He understood, listen, it may have been one of the richest, most physically blessed people in the world at that time. You realize that as far as where he is at and growing up. I mean, he's definitely within probably the top 0.1% of people in the world at the time. And yet he looks at the treasure that's there physically versus what he has with God's people, and he chooses instead to go after that. And so the other thing we see there in verse number 27 is he chooses to go forsake Egypt And this is a very good comparison, I think. Look at verse 23 and 27. He's a lot like his mom and dad, isn't he? He's not worried. He's not afraid of Egypt. He believed that God said what he would do. And you look at the end, as you go through verse number 28, you think about the faith that he kept. He believed that God would do what he said. He believed that if they followed through and the Passover, they followed through with that, and they sprinkled the blood and they placed it over the doorway, that God would pass over those houses. Did God do that? He absolutely did. And you think about this, and you think about the story of Moses, and all of these things are based on his faith in God. And going out on, and you and I may say, boy, he's going on a limb. You think about this could have ended very differently. You think about it for a second, though. Even if it would have ended differently, it would not have changed Moses' motivation. And obviously God had selected Moses, and he was going to go through and lead the people out of Egypt. But even if he hadn't, he still has faith enough that whatever would have happened, he knows at the end there's a greater reward there for following after God. And so all of these things looking ahead to those promises. Any other thoughts on Moses?
He really doesn't want to leave them out. That's what kind of surprises me. You know, all this behind, but when it comes down to time,
Yeah. Well, you remember, he tried to back out of it for pretty firmly there for a while until Aaron got involved, and he sure did. And I think back to, the problems you and I have. You think about him saying that, I'm not a good speaker, I can't do that, and God giving the solution of Aaron there. But even going through problems, thankfully for Moses, he did still carry through. And I think back to those excuses we may give. We may give excuses at times, but also knowing that if we carry through, the same will be true for us. Yeah. Okay, verse 29. Let's look at 29 and 30. So two little things here about Israel as a nation. Verse 29 says, by faith, and this day, it's talking about the nation of Israel, passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, which the Egyptians essaying to do were drowned. All right, let's think about 29 for a second. So remember, Israel, as they're being let out, and the bargain is made with Pharaoh that Pharaoh would release him, and as they're releasing him, Pharaoh, he decides, he thinks, in his mind, he thinks better of that. And so he sends out the Egyptian army, and they pursue them, and where are they trapped between? Well, they're trapped in between. This is not just a few people, by the way. This is a very large nation that's being let out as far as Israel's concerned. So Egypt is behind them, all the army of Egypt, which is not just a small little army. It was enough to keep them slaves for this very long period of time. And so they have the Red Sea. Well, the Red Sea is not something that you're going to cross in about 3 or 4 steps. If they can cross as just, you and I may be able to go through a creek. And so God opens the path through it. In verse number 29, as by faith Israel crosses, but what happens to the Egyptian army? They drown. That Red Sea collapses back over them. And I think it's very interesting. There's one thing that's said here, that they pass through as by dry land. You ever stepped in the bottom of a river? You ever thought it was dry enough to walk through? Usually it's enough if you're wearing mud boots, you're going to sink down, probably get stuck. God allowed that provision to happen. Obviously they walk through. Egypt tries to follow them, but they have enough faith in God. And I think it's very interesting that you look at them and they go through the Red Sea. How long was it before they started complaining, though, after they passed the Red Sea? What was it, about 3 or 4 days probably, that they started complaining again? They go off and they start complaining that, boy, we're better off dead in Egypt at this point. And so you see there the temptation of disobedience. And that's what's going to be said of that generation later. It's because of their disobedience. Did we not just spend a lot of time talking about them in chapters 5 and 6? Because of their disbelief. But this time they had belief, they had faith. But you see how quickly it can be swayed if we focus on the wrong thing. Now let's think about verse number 30, the other verse about the nation of Israel. It says, by faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they were compassed about 7 days. Well, if we see the conquest of Canaan happening, they're told to march around the city, remember, once per day. On the 7th day, they're told to march around 7 times and blow the trumpets and shout. And of course, the walls of Jericho fall outward. Now, if you were Israel, you may be thinking of, as you're coming upon this very good and very fortified city, how are you going to march around a city 7 days and all of a sudden it's going to lead to that city being conquered? That's probably what you may be thinking if you're thinking practically. You're not thinking about sieging the city or trying to find a way in. No, you're being told to walk around it. Nevertheless, they do that. What happens to Jericho? The walls fall and it's conquered. But do you remember for a moment, what was the next city in line after Jericho that they go and try to conquer? Kind of a weird word. We call it Ai, as they go, and that's the spelling of it, Ai. As they go and try to do that, they do not have as much success there, though. Do you remember why?
Because they hadn't obeyed.
That's right.
Jericho.
They did not obey what God told them to do. And so they didn't have as much success there, obviously. And so you think here in verses 29 through 30, these impossible tasks, these tasks that seemingly, we say, logically, physically, they make no sense. Of how are you going to cross the Red Sea without ships? How are you going to do it in that period of time? Well, God makes a way. How are you going to conquest and conquer this city just by marching around it? God finds a way. And so all these things are done, 29 and 30, by faith. Any thoughts on Israel? Israel's kind of an interesting nation, aren't they? For all of the things that they see and witness, to still have disbelief, to fail to follow God. And I think the lesson there is you and I of how we can fall away if we lose out on that faith. How about an interesting one? Verse 31. You ever thought about that she would be included in this great faith chapter of the Bible? Think about the people we talked about this one. We've talked about Abel, we've talked about Enoch, we've talked about Abraham, Sarah, we've talked about Isaac, Jacob. You think about talking about Moses, Israel. And then in verse 31, we're told this. By faith, the harlot Rahab perished not with them that believed not, when she had received the spies with peace. Now, stop at the end of verse 31 for a second. That's kind of an interesting person to include in our list of the by faith chapter, isn't it? So we're told, first and foremost, what is Rahab? A harlot, which we would call her. She's a Canaanite prostitute at this point. Now, Rahab, you think about the faith that Rahab has for a second. Let's paint the picture of her. So for 40 years ago, that Rahab is living, 40 years past, the Israelites had left Egyptian captivity. They had told about the plagues. They had crossed this great sea by dry land. We had seen when we were talking about how the two kings had fallen, their nations were destroyed as a result of them crossing the path of Israel. So Rahab had heard all of these things. And where is Rahab at, by the way? Let's talk about where she fits into the story. What city is Rahab in?
Jericho.
She's in Jericho. So we just got done talking about Jericho. Rahab is in Jericho. She's in this Canaanite city. And the irony is Rahab, who's not an Israelite, who's a Canaanite harlot, as it says here, she knows the stories of Israel. She believes in the stories of Israel, and she knows that the city is dangerous. And you think for a minute, what has the Israelites seen at this point? They've seen the Red Sea. Of course, this generation has not, but they've seen the miracles that God has performed for them. And so you think about the Israelites, all the miracles they've seen in their lifetime, looking at their nation. But to Rahab, they were stories. They were stories that she had heard, stories that she had been told. But did she have faith in God, the God of the Israelites? She absolutely did. And so she believed. And jot this one down in verse number 31. Here's a very interesting thing. Joshua chapter 2 and verse 11. She believes that God was the one and only God. And makes that statement known. Now, that's very different from what the Canaanites would have and believe. And so, remember, so the spies are there. The spies go into Jericho. And what did she ask for the spies to do?
Rescue her and her family.
That's right. Spare her family. Now, you think for a second, the deal that she made with them is, and whenever the spies leave out, where do they leave out at? Well, they leave out of Rahab's window, don't they? They're able to go there and they're able to leave out. She believed that the God of Israel would save her family. She believed that this promise that they made to her would be true. And you think about this, whenever the king goes in and they rush into Rahab's room, and they rush into where she's living at. When she demands the king, the king goes in, and the king's men demand to know where those men are at. What did Rahab do?
Tell the story.
She tells a story. She lies, doesn't she? She lies. Well, let's stop for a second and think about this. There's no excuse for lying to take place, and that's not the necessity of this story. But whenever she does go and you do consider who she is and what she has done to this point, I'm not at any time giving her a pass on what she is doing. But what she does do is protect the Israelite spies. Now, if there was a better way to do that, perhaps she could have done it. But you think for this point, if they found out she was lying, what would you think would have happened to her? Killed her in an instant. And probably not only her, they'd probably killed her family and everybody else. And so her knowing this, whenever you think about the other side of this, and you keep going in the story of Rahab, so 18 days before the Israelites came, what did she hang out her window? Do you remember? A scarlet cord, scarlet ribbon. And she does that for 18 days before the Israelites come. Her extended family had to be there whenever the city was conquered. And you think for a second, what would have happened if somebody would have turned her in? What would have happened if she would have gotten caught? Well, no doubt she would have gotten killed. And so whenever you think about Rahab, does she know what the Israelites are going to do? Does she know they're going to walk around the walls for 6 days and on the seventh day it's going to fall? No, she has no idea. So imagine what she was feeling, but still has faith enough to believe it. And so here is a really interesting example of a place where you would not expect faith to exist. And I think one reason we see Rahab given in this story, in this section, is our sinful past does not prevent faith from existing. What Rahab was did not prevent her from still having faith and following after the God of Israel. And so as we look at her story, she still certainly had that faith that it takes, even though she was not an Israelite. Any other thoughts on Rahab?
Well, I think that demonstrates through faith and obedience we can overcome a lot of shortcomings in our life.
That's true.
We just got to have that faith and obedience.
Yes. And you think for a second, the key is the second part of what Larry said. You think about the obedience that goes with faith. She could have absolutely said, I believe in God. I believe in the God of Israel. Chosen to do nothing and turn over the spies. But it was by her actions that she proved what she believed. And that's the book of James in a kind of a perfect summary is show me your faith by what you do, by your works. And talking about it is that faith that acts. And so that's that faith that you and I must have.
What happened to her?
She lived. Mm-hmm. She lived. Her and her family were saved. And you read the end of her story because you go in there and she's rescued from it. So it does come to fruition. She may be one of the few that in all of this actually see that promise being carried out. I think that's an interesting point. Good point to bring up. But yeah, she is rescued and her household. Yeah.
Isn't she in the lineage of Christ?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Not only that, but even further down the line, we're told about Rahab, who's not a upstanding citizen, we would say, as some of those, but she sure is. Yeah. Okay, one final part, and this is a kind of a conglomeration of the finale here, verses 32 through 38, and this is going to be, the writer basically says, listen, I can keep going and going and going and giving you all of these examples of faith. So here's a few that he's going to give us. Look at verse number 32. He says, and what shall I more say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and of Barak and of Samson and of Jephthah, of David also and Samuel and of the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover of bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. So pause there at the end of verse number 38 for a second. So he's saying, I could go on, and he says that but for time, I can just keep going and going and going. But here's the summary of these things. And so you think about, some of these are very obvious examples of faith. Some of them are not, though. Some of them are not the obvious examples whenever you first think of the matter. Whenever you think about Gideon, Gideon is remember the story of Gideon? Where do we find Gideon at in the Bible? He's during a very ugly period of Israel's history. Gideon, of course, is in Judges. So Gideon is Judges chapter 6 and 7. And Gideon was hesitant. It was kind of a very hesitant man. And he asked God for confirmation more than once. But ultimately, he did obey God. And so he does, even though he hesitates, he does follow through. How about Barak? Barak, remember him, Judges chapter 4, verses 1 through 24. Now, Barak was kind of an interesting as well. Now, he said he's not going to battle unless somebody goes with me. Who was that? It was that prophetess. They gave it away. Deborah. So remember, he said, I'm not going. Deborah doesn't come with me. Well, Deborah does go, and he does end up going into battle, and they do win. How about Samson? Would you say Samson is an upstanding figure in a lot of ways? Probably not. Probably not. Samson, whenever you think about his life, spent, and I don't think it's out on a limb to say he's probably spent the majority of his life immersed or surrounded by sin. He definitely had his problems. But by the end of his life, how does he end his life? Well, he ends up being committed to God. So that's Judges chapter 14 through 16, whenever you're thinking about Samson. For all that Samson was, he does follow through and follow God at the end. How about Jephthah? Remember him? You may not remember his name, but you probably remember what he did. So remember, he was the one that made and I would say rash vow to sacrifice the first thing that came out of his tent to God. Well, remember what was that?
His daughter.
His daughter. And so, as a result, he does just that. I'll sacrificing her as far as human sacrifice, that he does dedicate her to God, and he kept his word because he knew God aided him in battle. He takes place in Judges chapter 11. And I want to look at this because chapter 32, except for, even you think about the end of it, whenever you think about David and Samuel also having issues and having their own problems to deal with, would you say these men were morally excellent men? No, they're not. Would you say they had perfect obedience? No, we can demonstrate quite a few times, in fact, where that is not the case. So what connects them then? What connects them to being some people that we need to look at for their example? In the end, they had faith. That's right. In the end, it was that faith in God. And so because of that faith in God, and you think about verse number 33, and this is one of those things where there's so much more that can be said. Verse 33, how about how the one who conquered kingdoms? That reminds you of anybody? Probably talking about Joshua. Talking about Joshua, is he going in there and doing that? How about performing acts of righteousness? Righteousness. They do these acts of righteousness. Could have been talking about Samuel. Could have been talking about Ehud. How about obtaining promises? Well, David. David was one that certainly obtained promises. Of course, we know stop the mouths of lions. Talking about Daniel. And we'll talk more about these next week, because we're in a good point to talk about some of these figures that I think sometimes we may not give enough credit to in looking at their faith in God and what they ended up as a result of their faith in God. And so I think as we ultimately end this, we'll pause at verse number 34 for today and then finish out chapter 11. But really what I want us to look at, let's end by reading verse number 39 and 40. And then we'll go back and look through the specifics on this. But we'll summarize the end of it. It says, and these all, having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promise. God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect. So ultimately, all of these people we have talked about to this point, were they able to see that final promise in their lifetime that God said he would provide? No. because that promise, that ultimate promise, is heavenly. And so they still, despite not being able to receive the promise in this life, verse 40, God providing something far better for us, that they still live their life and still went after faith because of their faith in God. All right, any other thoughts before we quit for today? We'll pick up in verse number 34. Good thing to look at if you get a chance to study this week. As you look at 34 down to verse number 37, each of these fit a biblical character, and some of them more than one. So maybe a good study to go through those and see if we can find who exactly these characteristics fit of who we're talking about. And we'll stop at the end of verse 34. Appreciate all your comments. We'll pick up